How many people know a considerable amount about GMOs? Raise your hand. And how about Roundup? Raise your hand. All right, so...
You have to have a few of those basic questions.
Yes, that's what we're going for.
Oh, no.
Yes.
Steve, your questions.
Yes, I've got 100 questions here. So let's start with you, Carey. Tell us what you learned about the toxicity of Roundup, what it actually does, so that we understand it. So this is the basic building blocks now. Roundup 101. What should we know?
Oh my gosh, well, you could write a book about it. There's a lot of different things that I could answer with that, I suppose. I think it's important to know that glyphosate is the active ingredient in these formulated products. So branded products like Roundup or Ranger Pro or others, there are hundreds of herbicides sold around the world that have glyphosate in them. Glyphosate is not the only ingredient. There are other ingredients. Another primary ingredient is what we refer to as a surfactant. There are different types of surfactants. And what researchers have found, many of them around the world, and what our own National Toxicology Program has just started to study, and the first phase of the studies has confirmed, is that these formulated products are more toxic than glyphosate by itself. So that is something to consider. Glyphosate is never, you don't go out and spray your yard with glyphosate. You go out and spray your yard with a formulated product. Farmers aren't spraying, crops with just glyphosate. They're spraying with formulated products. So why our EPA has really only focused on requiring long-term studies for glyphosate, and they have not required in-depth significant studies on formulated products, is a big problem, is a big question. In 2016, that's when the EPA finally did say, hey, maybe we should work with the National Toxicology Program, and maybe we should start testing the toxicity of formulated products, these products that people around the world have been using for 40 years. So they started doing that. CropLife, which is the lobbying group, the very big and very powerful and rich lobbying group in Washington, D.C. that represents the agrochemical companies, didn't like that at all, very much. And they responded to EPA and said, why are you doing this? If you need information about formulated products, we can provide it for you. But EPA's, they're pressing forward a little bit on that. So, I think it's important to know that it's a more nuanced conversation. So the studies, when you're looking at different literature, some of them deal with glyphosate by itself, some of them deal with formulated products. It depends on what kind of study, it depends on what they're testing, what formulation, what doses. It's not a black and white thing, and I know people want things to be black and white, but it's not. There's a lot of nuance to this. There are areas about, I'm going to put everybody to sleep with this, dermal absorption is something that people don't know or maybe understand, but it's a very important thing. How rapidly and how effectively do these chemical combinations absorb into our skin if there's drift, if you're exposed to it. If you listen to Monsanto and you listen to that, you don't need to worry about that. I see people out spraying, their yards or whatever in sandals and, shorts and bare armed, and you spray it and then you go in and you slice an apple and you don't, wash your hands or whatever. But the internal records on this show that the dermal absorption rate is really, really powerful, much more so than some of our regulators understood. And you can see Monsanto talking about that in internal documents. So you need to have a respect and regard that this stuff is toxic. It's designed to kill living things, right? So that's important to pay attention to. And I guess my bigger message is, we talk a lot about Monsanto and we talk a lot about glyphosate. But I make the point in the book, and I try to say this at in every conversation, it's not just Monsanto and glyphosate. If Monsanto and glyphosate go away tomorrow, we haven't fixed anything. We haven't solved the problem. Yeah, you may feel good about, we beat the big Monsanto, but that's not it. It's many more chemicals that are in our food and in our water, in our environment, that are making people sick, that are combining to really tear down, the fabric of our world, essentially. We have nitrates in water, runoff from agricultural production. We have nitrates that are polluting the water. There's so many households in Iowa that are, don't have clean water, and some of the municipalities can't even run it through their systems to get it clean enough that it's being considered safe to drink. It's in violation of EPA regulations. I'm really on a tangent here. You're gonna have to shut me up. So back to the toxicity of glyphosate. It depends. It depends on what formulations it's being used on. It depends on, what the context of the use is. There's a lot of different things. It depends on if you're more susceptible, you're vulnerable, you're younger, you're older, you already have health problems. But there are a number of studies that clearly have shown that it can have harmful health impacts on people who are exposed to it. That's what the International Agency for Research on Cancer came up with, and that's what the lawyers laid out when they laid out all the science in the trial for Lee Johnson. The jurors found unanimously it wasn't even a close decision that this caused Lee Johnson's cancer and that Monsanto hid the risks.
I wanted to piggyback on two things you said. One is correct me if I'm wrong, but the surfactants actually, some of them actually augment the power of the glyphosate. So
the synergistic effects.
There's a synergistic effect, exactly, and some of them are more powerful than others. And so, separating these things out, the surfactants from the glyphosate in these different formulations is been ludicrous, because some of these surfactants make the glyphosate work that much stronger. And of course, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I don't think it's anyone's job, at least when I was doing the research for my book, it was no one's job to look at the synergistic effect of all of these chemicals together. Zach Honeycutt, for instance, one of the farmers that I profile in my book when I drove across the Great Plains, he makes his own cocktail, and we talked about how the farmer next to him has a slightly different cocktail for his crops, and everybody does something slightly different, and many of these, what they do is off-label. It's not, always following guidelines, it's following what they think works. And from what I understand, it's actually nobody's job to look at the synergistic effects of these things all mixed together. And that's pretty terrifying. There's a scientist in my book, there are 3 sections to my book. The first one is about the Midwest and the Great Plains, and the second one I went to Germany and I hung out with beekeepers and I studied honey and bees and what's happening with bees. And I went with the idea of this iconic pure substance, honey, and is it really so iconic and pure anymore? And the last section's about Oaxaca, and it's about corn, but there's a scientist at the University of California at Berkeley who said to me, which is kind of echoing what you just said, if it's designed to kill something, no one can tell you it's safe. And I think that's just a rule of thumb. Like, if it's designed, whether it's bleach or it's Drano or it's, a fungicide or whatever it is, if it's designed to kill something, you should think twice about it. So that's an important thing to consider.
One thing just that I wanted to add on this whole formulated product situation, I mentioned this to you earlier tonight, but this was sort of a shocking moment. In my Freedom of Information request documents that came back, there was one trope where the EPA was discussing formulated products and discussing the surfactants, and they were asking Monsanto, and this was 2016, these documents were all dated, and they were asking Monsanto to provide a list of all the surfactants that they had been using in their formulated products dating back through the 80s. And of course, my question to EPA was like, you don't know that? Like, these things are on the market, they've been on the market for 40 years, and you don't know what's in them? You're asking the company? It blew my mind.
Well, there was a study that I wrote about in my book, which was that, similar to this, which was that the soybeans have an estrogenic effect, a phytoestrogen, and then glyphosate actually augments that and makes the phytoestrogens, it's sort of, I don't know, I would have to find the page in my book, but it augments them to some degree. And then there's the surfactant, which then augments it even further. So eating these soybeans that have been sprayed with glyphosate and the surfactants have that much more of an estrogenic effect and were causally linked that much more significantly to breast cancer. So it had nothing to do with them being a GMO necessarily. It had to do with the fact that they were sprayed so heavily and the surfactants that were used that made them sort of, estrogenic on steroids, soybeans, that were causing cancer much more readily. So, if you want the details, you'll have to read it by book, but because I outline it there exactly how that worked, but it was really interesting to me to read those studies and understand that it's, an organic soybean may be a much more benign thing for women than an inorganic, highly sprayed. In this case, it would be a GMO soybean that's been sprayed with Roundup and the surfactants that come with it.